right. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, depending on where you're at. Let's just give this a few more seconds to fill in. See, there's more and more attendees joining us, which is great. Just a little bit. All right, so I think we can get this thing going. All right, well, welcome everybody to our webinar today, titled Managing Operational Security with Efficiency, OTORIO and ServiceNow Integration for Holistic Operational Security Management. First of all, I would like to highlight that this session is being recorded, so you can come back, revisit this at your leisure. Just quick FYI here. Another thing I'd like to let you know is that there's been a slight change of plans. So for everybody who is disappointed that Dave Cullen is not here, I am filling his spot this morning. I am Shannon Friedman, an engineer here at OTORIO, and I will be moderating this session today. Quick info, Q&A is going to be open. We'll be taking care of questions towards the end of this webinar. So yeah, quick intro to me. Like I said, I'm Shannon, an engineer here, long-standing history in OT. So I used to be a field service engineer. I did system integration and so forth. However, let's take a look at our more interesting individuals for today's webinar. Robert, how about you introduce yourself here from the ServiceNow side?
Morning and afternoon, folks. Robert Rash. I'm one of the product managers and own the OTM, or Operational Technology Management products here at ServiceNow. Been here about 3 years, been working in and involved with the industrial space as a control engineer and programmer, developer, project manager, all sorts of hats I've worn over the years for about the past 25 or so. But thanks again for joining, and I look forward to having this conversation with everybody.
That's awesome. Thank you, Robert. And now over to our CTO and co-founder, Yair.
Thank you, Shannon. So hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Yair Attar. I'm the CTO and co-founder of OTORIO. We are an OT cybersecurity platform providers, working in this space for about 6.5 years already. Working with different CISOs, management within our customers and partners ecosystem. So really accompanying and seeing from real close this OT security journey maturity, how customers are addressing that. So this will be an interesting discussion today. Prior to OTORIO, more than I would say a decade, from software engineering to cyber defensive operational, leading Israel nation state incident response and threat hunting team. So a lot of cyber defensive operational experience from a nation state type of background. So thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Yair. And now with no further ado, let's get straight to the discussion. So ServiceNow and OTORIO, they've partnered together to really ensure OT security in the operational environment. Now, before we really dig deeper on the joint solution, how about both of you tell us a little bit about what you're doing around OT?
Sure, I'll kick off. So
please do.
So everyone knows, ServiceNow's historically been, I want to say, involved in those IT-centric use cases. We've always been that system of action there. And some of the feedback that we got, and this is more of a history lesson than anything, some of the feedback that we got from those existing customers that we were helping on those IT use cases, those customers had oil fields and substations and manufacturing facilities and that sort of thing. And as time progressed, right, we all hear of Industry 4.0 and that sort of thing, and the increasing complexity and just connectivity in those spaces, right? They started to ask us to lean into that space, right? And what and the general ask was, we do a great job around visibility and security and service management and that sort of thing in the IT space. But they wanted to address those same use cases in the OT space. And quite frankly, a lot of those customers, right, that was 80% of what they owned. And so, based on, again, those aspects and the fact that, we're manufacturing in that just industrial space is starting to have a larger just cybersecurity target on their back, we started going, pursuing those use cases about, I want to say 4.5 years or so ago. We start investigating, let's think about what we can do well within that space. And that's really what we started to look at, right? We have those general use cases that we addressed in IT, right? You have assets you want to own and manage and inventory and keep up on the life cycle. And then once you manage and inventory those, you want to think about use cases around those. You want to fix them, right? Whether in that fixing could be involved, with ITIL processes, service management, change management, and that sort of thing, or obviously that security remediation piece. And that's really what we started doing, is putting together a bank of solutions that we call my product, right? We call operational technology management, that really addresses those same basic use cases in IT over in the OT side of the industrial side of the house. And that's what we consider OT within ServiceNow. Is everything. I like to joke and say it's everything without carpet underneath it, but it's everything that's really, that impacts your production or your compliance or that sort of thing. So that's really where we start to lean in with OTORIO quite a bit, is gaining that visibility to those lower level devices, the sensors, robots, things all the way down to level 0. And so now we can start to give customers the ability to manage that landscape no differently than they do their IT landscape. That's my 2-minute pitch.
Very good. That sounds exciting. Yair, anything to add?
Yeah, so briefly, I mean, OTORIO, we're, I think, changing a bit the paradigm of or the approach within the OT security space. I mean, the OT security space have been existing for quite some time, and of course, we're seeing we're going to talk about some trends and things we're seeing within the market. But I think that what we're doing as a company is shifting towards a left of boom, exposure management, risk identification, and proactive analysis, rather than there's a lot of other, I would say, solutions out there focusing on threat detections and monitoring, and it's an also very critical component. But what we're trying to help organizations is, first of all, help them understand what they have, where they have it, to what specific process it belongs. So, and this also goes along very well with our integrations with ServiceNow. And then understand how it is exposed, how also the different security controls within the environment affect the overall exposure of those critical assets that are serving very critical processes. This is highly important because you cannot, a lot of the questions we're seeing is, what do I do with all the findings, right? You cannot just go and fix everything. So helping them tailor to their environment, to their controls, what is really potentially exploitable, where should they focus, and help them to understand what they can do with those types of gaps, exposures, vulnerabilities. So we're basically an OT exposure management platform providers. And I think, Robert, I will surprise you that there are some carpeted areas. If I take, for example, airports, which we also support, there are a lot of carpets in airports. You'll be surprised. Sometimes the luggage stacks on them. That's kind of shame. But you have, I mean, today, I think OT, IoT, cyber physical systems is starting to be everywhere, not just critical infrastructure and manufacturing, which is the obvious case, but everything is now becoming more connected. I mean, we have building management systems, solutions, HVAC, you name it, that at the end of the day affects operational processes wherever they are.
The advent of IoT. Well, very good. Thank you. So now, with that being said, how does the integration between ServiceNow and OTORIO align with broader industry trends, especially in the operational security management? And what are the unique benefits and the values that it offers in comparison?
Ooh, I don't think we have enough time to address all of those, but I'll give give it a try. So obviously, there's an asset discovery piece. Yair mentioned, right? The OT's all around us, right?
Mm-hmm.
And traditional IT discovery tools, just one, obviously, and we can go into details, but they don't do a very good job at identifying those things, and so even if they could, in the past, I've actually been asked to leave a facility for using said tools in an industrial space because sometimes they can break networks. and devices, and not good things come from that. But we just have that first it's that simple process of just enhanced discovery of those devices all the way, a complete discovery, right? And I make the joke of everything without carpet underneath it, but in essence, what we consider OT within ServiceNow is if you feel that that device is important enough to deploy Ottorio there and discover it, we're going to consider that OT. And to Yair's point, that could be all sorts of devices, building automation systems, IoT devices, servers, workstations, PLCs, the works. And of course, once we take that asset inventory, right, we start to enrich that. And Yair mentioned that. Well, there's also a cyber physical risk that gets associated with those devices, right? And so now that we have that information from Ottorio, not only the device and asset information, but also that risk profile information, we can start to look at it because ServiceNow, we wear that system of action hat. In order for you to start carrying out those workflows, you need to not only know from a security perspective what that cyber risk is, but also what, to Yair's point, what that thing does within your plant or within your space. Does it move, conveyors and baggage through an airport, or does it really just kind of move exhaust air through a bathroom, right? You start to prioritize those things differently based on the device types. One of the feedbacks that we get from customers, right, is they turn on an IDS solution like Ottorio, and the first thing that they notice is they have 10,000 vulnerabilities, right, with a single facility. And the first thing that they do is either they just completely ignore those, or they hand them off to someone in the SecOps group, and then the first question they ask is, well, what do we start to do with these? What am I going to do with the list of 10,000 of these things? So now we start to work together to prioritize those things and say, well, we're going to prioritize these 4 because they're more critical for asset or personnel safety, or these are for critical production or compliance or whatever the thing, whatever that might be. The other piece of that, and I want to getting away from the proactive stance, is when we think about how we're really going to deal with a security incident within those spaces, right? We get a lot of feedback, and we all see the news, where if you imagine the event of a security incident within a plant for a ransomware event, for example, it's always the hair on fire activity if you're trying to contain that threat. You're trying to keep your name out of the media, right? You're thinking about all of these things from a business aspect or a cyber aspect to keep that event from spreading. But little care goes into actually the physical aspect of it. And that's a feedback that we get from customers, right? There's not that playbook that exists currently to think about how we properly react to those cyber physical aspects of a security incident response. So working with Ottorio, now we can address both angles of that, not only the cyber piece, but also properly shutting down equipment, clearing product off of belts, making sure the area is safe, right? That's a lot of that downtime that's occurred, right? It's based on, those folks not taking that care and feeding of that physical aspect, and they're just blindly unplugging ports or hitting, breakers and that sort of thing. And there's, equipment repair costs that's associated with that. Hopefully that answers the question. I know that's a very long-winded response. And you got anything to add to that one?
Yeah, I think, and maybe let me try and highlight a very specific areas where I think one area where our integration really provides a lot of value to the customer is we act as this, discovery tool, it's a very, we won't get into the details, but very scalable approach to, at the end of the day, onboard all those detailed attributes of the different assets to ServiceNow CMDB, that at the end of the day acts as this organizational IT, OT, IoT, whatever you want to call it, like one place for all, right? Where it becomes this single pane of glass, where we are this source of truth for everything coming from the OT area, where at the end of the day, besides that, we're identifying anything that's happening from a risk perspective within those environments, any changes, any new security gaps. So we add more items, and this goes to the incident management where we feed ServiceNow, and then those workflows that have been defined are starting to be created and being run automatically. So once they have been defined in ServiceNow, you now have this clear understanding how you should act based on the different finding from our solution. One of the additional very unique use cases is this, not just the operational context that ServiceNow adds a lot to it. We're also providing this evidence-based exploitation analysis scoring. I mean, how much this asset is reachable within the OT space to this risk modeling of ServiceNow that at the end of the day allow you to understand from an operational context perspective, but also from the security controls you have, how it all plays together. And this brings, I think, a very good, comprehensive, unique approach from an integrated risk management to those large organizations we serve.
Very
I
good.
like
So in
that.
a nutshell, it is about collecting all the assets, kind of enriching them, and then passing it on into ServiceNow to establish standardized IT workflows in the OT space. Is that a fair way of putting it in just one little sentence?
I think it's extending it to the OT space and adjusting it to the OT space, because at the end of the day, the workflows that fit IT will not be the same.
Mhm.
But the foundation, the tools, the know-how already exists. So it's just extending it and adjusting it to the OT space.
Very good.
100%. Yair mentioned risk, right? And for those that aren't familiar with the OT solution, risk is how we identify basically what we're going to prioritize in those workflows and playbooks. If I'm assigned 15 tasks, the one with the highest risk score gets prioritized. And within the IT space, risk is, I don't want to diminish the IT space, but it's very narrow. Within the OT space, here I mentioned it, right? That can be a multitude of different things, right? And we're starting to learn when we talk to customers is not only is it a multitude of different things, but it's very dynamic. Known exploits, right? What the device is doing that day, the shift, the product being manufactured. There's all sorts of components that kind of go into this and how we should think about prioritizing those playbooks and what gets remediated first.
So that all sounds really good. However, I can imagine that there's some challenges that emerge during the in the terms of operational security. So how does the integration address that?
I think that, let
Go ahead.
me, yeah, no, sorry for stealing your thunder. But I'm sure you're gonna have a lot to add after I finish. So I'm gonna try and narrow it down to the key pain points we're hearing from the market that we're engaging it. Is first step is, what do I have, right? The very first question, I don't know. And it's also very challenging to go and deploy or roll out a solution in those complex environments. We're talking about sometimes organizations with dozens, if sometimes not hundreds of sites. So how do I do it in a scalable manner? So first thing is really visibility. The second part is really, what do I do with it? Now that I have visibility, now that I know where am I vulnerable, now that I know what do I have, how do I start addressing it in a governed approach, systematic, prioritized approach based on the context, the potential controls that I have, how it all plays together. Because I think everyone understands today that you cannot just go and fix everything, right? So especially in the OT space, you're going to find places where, if you're going to touch something, warranty challenges, there's this 24/7 operational, etc. You cannot really restore it, multiple challenges. So can I do more with other controls that I have? Can I prioritize better? And then within maintenance windows, take some specific actions. And this is where exactly I think our combination with ServiceNow addresses those challenges, those questions, from automated discovery and understanding of the exposure to creating one data lake of everything I see, and then workflows, processes, definitions, and all those types of things, and enabling better collaboration. Collaboration is key here, especially in the IT OT space, right? Because those projects are being driven by the CISO team, but the ones actually that are going to need to take actions to implement, to do something about it, they are the ones that understand the potential consequences. They are the ones within the site. They're not cybersecurity experts. So enabling the collaboration between those two stakeholders together is a key challenge where we, I think, together addressing it in a very good way.
You mentioned the complexity piece. I think that's, I don't think I have a single customer to date that does discovery and all the correlation of those events and devices in the same way, right? We know that these, and I think that kind of speaks to why we need that IT and OT convergence, why there's been that separation in the past is, typically these, obviously these are way different protocols than what we're used to in IT, right? That adds to the complexity. Typically, we build these facilities out for current known production rates and levels and what we want to build. But if we want to add to those later, if we want to add another line or increase our production rates or yield or that sort of thing, right? Typically, these things are just bolted on. They're Lego systems, right? And so that adds to the complexity. And of course, we all know about obviously the increasing connectivity of all these assets, right? But 10 years ago, we never dreamed that we would even be using PCs in the manufacturing and the OT space, and now we're talking about cloud connectivity and AI and that sort of thing, right? So it's the complexity is built on each other, and typically, historically, we've seen that the network and security management teams have just giving the OT space their own VLANs and said, "You break it, you bought it," right? But that's not the case, and what we're hearing from the CISOs is obviously Nirvana is they would love to carry out, as you mentioned, those same policies and governance and procedures that they've already built in IT over into that OT space. And so now what we're starting to see, is we're providing that context to do so, right? And that's kind of the wonderful thing that's coming from this integration and this partnership with Otorio is now that not only can they standardize with all these different complexities, from these Lego blocks of different plants and acquisitions and that sort of thing, but they've already built a very strong practice in IT, right? And they've worked very hard on those governance and policies and procedures, and now they're starting to not only standardize that across the manufacturing and OT landscape, but they're starting to obviously pull that governance as well over there, and they're being able to do so from the same interface, right? Again, we're just applying that context that you mentioned, or that translation that they need in order to do so. Right now, they are starting to understand what they're dealing with, right, in that landscape.
Very good. Now, one of the keywords that I keep hearing is asset discovery and finding things on the network. Now, we all know that in an operational environment with OT technology, it is difficult to do that. Now, what are some best practices to discover and collect asset information in an OT environment? And does it really have to be continuously, or can we just create a snapshot? What are the upsides there?
Ooh, I'll start. We always start with customers, right, that already have something. When I say something, they have an idea, right? And sometimes that idea of what they own is, either locally managed in Excel or SharePoint, or it's in a procurement system or something, right? But there's always data that we can always leverage. And we always encourage customers to think about our reconciliation engine and the multi-source CMDB to pull in those additional sources of data, right? That's kind of the magic of ServiceNow, is all those integrations to Attorio and others to add more context to that CMDB. But from an automated standpoint, right, and I'm coming to it, and I've been an OT guy my whole life, right? And I always had this perception of, we have this blank CMDB and we're going to use Attorio to populate it, right? Which is a great concept, but it's more than just about populating the CMDB, especially in a regulatory environment, right, or a compliance heavy industry, right? Is once these devices exist within ServiceNow, right, and this is just from a pure asset management perspective, right? It's not only about populating that CMDB, but it's also about that notification of change, right? I've been guilty of this in my past, right, where I've had the hair on fire activity and I need to fix something, and so I'll just ignore for the time being the change control process and procedures, and I'll just make a change, right? And one of the first use cases that we're asked to fulfill, especially on that regulatory side, oil and gas and the utility space, is there something that exists within my landscape? Somebody's made some sort of change to it, right? And I want to be notified. And so that automated discovery piece with Otorio really speaks to that, right? That device already exists within your CMDB, right? We already have an inventory of it, but something's changed. Somebody downloaded a new piece of code, they changed the firmware. And of course, there's no change control record that exists or that's associated with that device. After that change and that automated discovery, it's going to notify us that there's something going on in your network that you're not aware of, and obviously escalate that up to an engineering manager or somebody in QC or whatever the case might be. But it leans very heavily into that asset lifecycle piece as well, outside of the security landscape and those use cases.
Yeah, I would even add that, I guess it's not as dynamic maybe as we're potentially used to in IT, but it's still very dynamic. Giving you some examples is, we can, for example, or maybe talking for a second about like ways of discovering assets. It's not just, I think the industry understands today that only passive discovery, unfortunately, as much as less intrusive as it is, will not give you really good visibility, because not everything goes through the traffic, or you're going to need to wait for a long time until the specific protocol goes by. And you're also going to need to deploy a lot of sensors in many places, which will be very, very heavy. So it needs a combination of a variety of sources, as Robert mentioned, from could be project files, which are basically sort of like a backup configuration file within an engineering station. Could be communicating with the assets. There are many, many tools, by the way, Profinet analyzers for Siemens devices. I mean, there are many tools that are being used by the automation vendors themselves for those specific assets. DCS SCADA management solutions holds a lot of valuable information within their solutions that are focused on operational management, but still have very valuable information on the assets themselves. So there are many ways to collect data on assets to make it a scalable, automated fashion. And what we're seeing in the field is that those environments are changing. Let me give you a few examples. First thing, I mean, we're taking those project files. We usually see that what's in reality exists and what those project files represents are not exactly 100% the same. By the way, this is a finding by itself, because now it means that your backup files are not, or either something has changed and it shouldn't be, or maybe you need to update your backup files and systems. This is one part, right? Another part we're seeing is there are maintenance windows, and all of a sudden we're seeing new equipment, new sensors, new cameras, new type of digitalization projects that, of course, enhance productivity, and they're always welcome, but nobody really understood how to connect them. And all of a sudden, your building management system is connected to your production or other things we're seeing, unfortunately, with many projects that we are working with that are happening in the field. So yes, I think today already, there is a need for an automated fashion of discovering assets and seeing any changes within those OT environments.
And now that you said all that, you're bringing up a very good point. You did say that OT is not as dynamic, but it still is dynamic. And that reminded me of my days of being a system integrator, where very often I would bring a little IPC with a piece of software on there, and it would be a Windows computer, and I just go in and introduce it to the OT network. And there was no checks or balances before me bringing it on site. So I just had free hand in connecting it. So there is rogue contractors out there that just come into your OT network and connect things, whether you like it or not.
Yeah. By the way, you raise a very, very valid point, that there are sometimes those assets that are not always connected, but system integrators, service providers, suppliers, when there's an issue, when there's even engineers within on-site, they need help with something. So secure remote access, I mean, it's not the focus maybe for today, but definitely something that should be addressed. But in general, we're still seeing all of a sudden a new asset being connected from a supply chain or on-site, of course, from a supplier that nobody checked, nobody verified, and maybe shouldn't be allowed to be connected. So seeing this automatically and immediately alerting on that and taking actions based on that is critical.
When we initially talked to let's say security leadership, CISOs and the like, that are, I want to say, early on in their OT security journey, we ask them, what's keeping you up at night? What's preventing you from leveraging, what you do well in IT over in OT? And everyone mentions the same thing. I don't know what's on my network, and I don't know who's on my network. To your point, right? It's those two pieces, right, that really that's keeping them up at night. I'm guilty of the same, right? I've always left my instance of TeamViewer or my engineering workstation at a customer site, right? And that's a more common practice than should be. We're actually including with our future release, we're doing catalog request. If you're familiar on the IT side with ITSM, on OTSM, we're including catalog requests as part of our initial release. And one of our sample catalog items that we're including with our demo data is just that, secure remote access. We thought, well, what is the one thing that folks are requesting more in the OT space than anything? And we thought, well, secure remote access would probably be at the top of their list.
Indeed. Now, staying on the topic of visibility, I do have one last question before we open up to Q&A here. So, if visibility really is the first step to security risk management, what can be done with that data to make informed decision making and really ensure more resilient operations? Is there any leeway in that, any options we have?
Well, for sure. You mentioned risk, right? And so I can tell you if the security team goes to the production environment, goes to the plant manager and say, we have this critical problem with a cybersecurity threat, your definition of critical and his definition of critical is probably way different, right? And so that's where we start to be. And yeah, you mentioned it, right? That's where we start to meet in the middle, right? So with that data that we collect from Otorio, right, we're starting to add that along with what those process folks would consider risk, right? And that's the intent it is at the end of the day is again to be that system of action and help those customers playbook those remediation efforts, whether it's a threat or a vulnerability, right? And in order to do so, we need both angles of that approach, right? We need that cyber risk, and we also need that physical risk. Also, we need to know, and if you think about, and this is really how we really thought about the design process of this product, is what's different between IT and OT, and it's really about the remediation efforts, right? What gets done at the ground level. And so we took that angle of approach and we thought, what information does that individual need that's remediating this vulnerability or this threat in order to do so without, obviously, with the least amount of impact? And so that's what we're starting to look at, right? Is we'll take the cyber threat, we'll take the asset, and then we associate it not only with the process, but also the related processes, right? It's about, I want to say, the blast radius, because what you need to know when you're starting to go through that process of, I have this threat or this vulnerability, what information do I need, right? And it's really about that blast radius of that impact, right? So what else do I need to shut down? What processes do I need to take in consideration if I shut this process down, right? What else, basically, what is it? How much money is going to cost me if I take this device out of service for any length of time? So it's about combining those two pieces. Something else that we found that's interesting, and I want to say a differentiator between IT and OT, is within IT we see the security leadership and the SOC team. They have visibility of those threats or vulnerabilities, and then they have a team of folks that actually carry out that task, right? When what we're starting to see customers lean into, different than OT, is those two groups still exist, but that individual that's carrying out that task or plugging into a PLC and patching it because there's a known vulnerability may not necessarily make that determination of what to do with that vulnerability, right? And so we're starting to see customers leverage ServiceNow in the aspect of, there's owners within any industrial space that they know AGVs, or they know robots, or they know the SCADA system or the PLCs. And they're looking at, from a holistic view across their entire organization, here's all of my vulnerabilities, or here's all my threats for the product that I own. And those folks are able to make that determination based on all the factors that we get from Attorio and these other sources on how to deal with that. Maybe the device is reaching end of life, and instead of patching it, they're just going to mitigate that threat, right? And they're going to go ahead and replace it in a couple of years instead, right? So it adds that additional persona in the middle to help make that determination, right, and make those decisions, and then create that remediation task and those efforts to be carried out by those local technicians and control engineers and that sort of thing.
Interesting.
I think that at the end of the day, I mean, don't get me wrong, visibility is important, but as we said, it's the first step of the journey, meaning that once you have it, then really comes the interesting area of taking decisions that are data-based driven. And at the end of the day, I think what's really, really important to make informed decisions is context. Context of what those assets, what process do they serve, how they're all potentially connected, how my controls affect whether this vulnerable asset is actually exploitable, whether I have maybe a non-critical asset, but that is very connected to many other critical assets. So taking all those types of artifacts that at the end of the day, I call under the header of context, is really important to take informed decisions. And I think this is exactly where our integration lies, where, let me put it like this. I think I had a very interesting discussion with a CISO of a large manufacturing OEM, and they he said it like this: basically, your solutions, I mean, OTORIO and ServiceNow, help me to, let's say that my overall risk is, I don't know, 80%, like the technical risk, like all the findings, the vulnerabilities, the gaps, the exposures, everything that's happening. But actually, my residual risk is 40% because I have controls, because the potential impact of this process is very low. So this technical risk of 80 goes to 40%. And now I can define in the next quarter, in the next half year, I want to get it to 20 to my risk acceptance level. And those are the actions I need to take on those specific processes, on those specific findings. And then I have the possibilities to understand what actions should I take. This is exactly what allowed large enterprises to have informed decision-making in a governance way, and driving it from really, I would say, strategy perspective to implementation phase.
Very good. I wish I could let this discussion run for much longer. However, it is time for our Q&A, but thank you very much, Robert. Thank you very much, Yair. This has been great and really informative. But our audience does have some questions, and we do have a few trickling in. And again, shout out to the audience. Please keep them coming, because now's the time. If you have any questions, please let us know. But let me just grab the first one right here. So is there any successful examples of implementation scenarios where OTORIO's integration with ServiceNow has not only resolved immediate security issues, but also helped in the broader organizational transformation?
So I'll jump to that first. And I think recently we had a very interesting success story that actually even presented us in different conferences. One of the largest automotive manufacturing OEMs globally, where few examples of their journey and how it helped them to really start addressing the OT cybersecurity space. So first of all, they were heavily already dependent ServiceNow from an IT perspective, CMDB, workflows. Let me say it's a German organization, so everything is very organized and in the right processes. And they, for the OT space, they had it before, like different solutions. It was very siloed. They have what they call within their sites their BISOs, business information security officers, and there was no clear process around that. First thing what we did with them was really rolling out our solution globally with all manufacturing sites. And I'm happy to say that actually this was very, very fast because our ability to collect data from multiple data sources and not just relying on passive discovery. So this allowed us to roll out very, very fast. And we're talking about very large and complex organization. And then what we did after pushing everything to ServiceNow, it was really, really beautiful to see. We had a workshop, actually, I think not that long time ago, where there were ServiceNow, the service provider or integrator for ServiceNow, another, like I would say, OT risk management consultants, and us, where we discussed about what would be best in order to leverage all capabilities from risk management, prioritization, and workflow definition. And they did something really, really nice, leveraging our integrations of, at the end of the day, they want to look from an integrated risk management approach. So not just, I mean, OT shop floor is one part. They have vehicle security. They have, other types of security, or sorry, not just security, other type of risks. And they want to have an integrated approach. And then based on that, driving prioritizations to the maintenance level, where based on the workflows created within ServiceNow and based on all the automation around identification, security controls, effectiveness, and things like that, they're now able of taking mitigation actions, not just on the assets, but also on the controls, and immediately identify how it all affects by reducing the potential, again, not remediating, but at least mitigating those risks and addressing it in a very clear and processed way. I think this was a really, again, not all organizations at this level. I think this is a very mature approach, but I am seeing, working with the industry, how everyone are getting to that. I mean, again, because once there are the findings, then really the question of what do I do about it goes to prioritizations, workflow definitions, what stakeholders are doing. So this is where I think the market is also going, even for less mature type of organizations.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that you mentioned, and I've seen it with this customer, I've seen it with a lot of customers, right? If you imagine what we're doing in that space, right? This involves multiple groups of people. The security team, the SOC team, and those folks that's carrying out that security remediation, they don't understand the physical space, right? And so obviously part of these workshops that we're in, with these customers, these folks included, we're starting to bring in process engineers and control engineers and maintenance folks and those sort of things, right? Everybody plays a part in these workshops and building out this context, right? And one thing that we've noticed with this customer, and obviously with every other customer that we've been involved with to this point, is there's, we use the term convergence, right? And that's really kind of what it speaks to, because now we're starting to see these two groups work together, from IT and OT. But something interesting I want to say tangibly interesting that we see on the OT space is they're the ones that's providing that context to security in the SOC team and those the help desk support and that sort of thing. They're showing them, here's our landscape, here's our manufacturing process, here's all of these dependencies in the context that you need to carry out your remediations, right? And so one thing that happens is they understand, well, these folks now have this sheet of music that I provided. So there's inherently just that, I want to say, advanced trust that's starting to kind of bleed over from IT and OT, right? Because they're always willing to help, but now they understand that now these folks that typically don't step into that environment does have that visibility of that context of what they're about to go through. That's what they need. But the other interesting thing that we find with these folks, and Yair's customers, no different, is if you think about what they're providing is, if you take this device out of service within this environment, this is the potential impact of it. If I start patching for a vulnerability or thinking about security incident, but those use cases carry outside of security as well. And once they start to provide that information, they start to understand, well, if we're providing you this, we can leverage that same context and that same information to do our job, right? And for incident response and change control and that sort of thing. And so it very much starts to snowball into the process and the automation and maintenance and just day-to-day remediation of problems within the shop floor as well.
Awesome.
I know we're running out of time, but I think something that actually could be valuable and insightful for the audience. The whole thing about workflow definition. I think this is something that we do see that differentiate between company to company based on the stakeholders, the maturity, the processes that exist. But it's really nice to see how, based on the joint solution, companies can adjust it to their specific needs. I mean, I'm seeing we are serving also a very large conglomerate that serves multiple industries, from airports to seaports to cement to energy and renewables and things like that. And they took a decision of a central SOC that acts as this single place that prioritize and sometimes act even as a dispatcher, and then push to the business unit what they should prioritize. And the business unit with the relevant people from the sites are the one that take actions, compared to the one I just mentioned before, this large manufacturer that basically the tools are providing as this governance layer, but then the BISOs within the sites are the one that defining, because they are the risk owners, what they want to tackle in order to get to the place they want to be. So you can adjust based on the solution stack to your specific needs and your stakeholders. And even if you have a small team, and even if you have a large team, you can still leverage the solution and adjust it to your needs.
Very good. Thank you for that additional insight right there. Now, we are at the end of our time here. There's 2 more minutes on the clock. We will make sure to reach back out to you to all questions that have not been answered as part of the Q&A here. So we'll get back in touch with you there, no worries. Again, thank you very much for joining us today. I think it was a very informative session, and we hope to see you again next time around. And thank you very much again, Robert, Yair, for your time. I think this was a great discussion. So I hope you all have a great rest of your day, wherever you may be. And thanks again.